All right, is this thing on? Check, check. One, two, three. Does my tie look all good? Yep, good to go. Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. Welcome to Flipped Video for Chapter 4.2b. In this video, we're going to look into some events that occurred after the Indian Wars. Really, you could say that these events could be effects of the Native Wars. All right, so we're going to talk about the Indian Homestead Act, cause and effect of this. So first off, just a reminder, lots of gold miners are moving in to this area as people are slowly finding gold in Washington Territory. Now, as we learned back all the way in previous chapters, gold mining was not a major way to get rich in Washington Territory. However, it's gold fever. You see it, you want it. So people are moving in, illegally trespassing on native land. Also, settlers are coming in, answering the call of Manifest Destiny to spread the culture and ideas of American culture. And they're moving in around native reservations, trying to get land, and more people are coming in, and it's just a great big bear hug with the natives in the middle, and they don't want to be bear hugged. So, the American government, trying to better protect the rights of the Native Americans, decided to make it legal for Native Americans to own land. However, some problems come into play with that. A lot of cultural differences, as we learned, and again in previous flipped videos. Natives don't view land ownership the same thing as we do. So because of that, settlers could coerce natives to sell their land. Coerce means like persuade. Or settlers outright would use fraud or unlawful means to get natives land. Let's now talk about the Dawes Act, which came into play in 1887. Let's talk about some causes to the Dawes Act. Then we'll actually talk about what the Dawes Act was and some effects of it. First off, a huge cause of the Dawes Act was a desire to assimilate natives. The thought was if they adopted white culture, then they would merge nicely with the rest of the population. And I think hopefully you would know what would happen if they merged into the rest of the American population. And that would be that the American government would not have to keep paying tribes money because they're no longer on reservation land. They would not have to oversee Native or Indian welfare. Again, they don't have to be doing all this. They don't want to do it. Remember, the initial plan was to dissolve and get rid of the reservations. Also, doing all of this, giving them all this money is keeping the tribes in poverty, keeping them poor, at least in our standards. Also, they wanted to reverse the damage done by reservations. I think they could see that there was problems happening. However, as this picture shows, the Dawes Act wasn't all it was cracked up to be. As previously said, the Dawes Act occurred in 1887 and was started or introduced by a man over on the East Coast who had this big feeling idea, as I quoted earlier, that if the Native Americans took up the idea of individual land ownership, they would easily assimilate and merge into American culture. So what they were going to do is they were going to break up reservation land into individual tracts to any of those people who are registered. The head of the household would receive 1/4 of a section, which would be about 160 acres, which, if you remember, was less than what they got in the Donation Land Act if there was a family. A single person who is 18 years and older, or an orphan who is 18 years or younger, would receive 1/8 of a tract of land, which would be about 80 acres. And anyone born after this act came into law would receive 1/16 of land, which isn't very much. The land would be held in trust for 25 years, and any extra land that was left over after all this was said and done could be resold by the government to any settlers. Now, a lot of people back then, and a lot of historians now, view this as a big land grab by the American government. Hence the picture previously showing this gentleman here munching and chomping the land. He's eating it up for Americans, American settlers that is, while the natives just get a little bit of land. Also, natives had 40 years to choose the land they wanted. If they didn't, the superintendent of Native Affairs would choose for them. Now let's talk about some of the effects of the Dawes Act. First up, before we talk about the effects, we have to know that most of these natives got lousy farmland. Too deserty, too dry to really do anything, no irrigation. Now some of the effects. First, it hurt the native culture. That's probably one of the biggest things it did. Remember, the natives saw land as sacred. It was part of their religion, part of their culture. They had a very special connection to it, a connection that we don't have as Americans then, and maybe not as much now. They never changed the land for their own economic gain. With this idea of the Dawes Act, they were supposed to become farmers, which is the exact opposite of what they did. As a farmer, you change the land for your own economic gain, which is something totally different, totally foreign to them. The effect was this. Citizenship would be given to those natives who fully assimilated into American culture. So all of a sudden, you're going to have a rift between people who are tired and sick of the government pushing in on them and making them change, and they're just finally throwing their hands up and going, I'm done. I will be like you. I will farm. I will stop what I'm doing. And you had those who are like, no, till the end, we are not going to change. Kind of like Chief Kamiakin and Chief Joseph. They weren't going to change. So all of a sudden, you're going to start to see a rift within the native communities. Another problem was with inheritance. What if you had a Native American gentleman who passed away and his land goes into inheritance and he has more than one child? You only had 160 acres. If you have, let's say, like, I don't know, 4 or more kids, they're going to get under 40 acres, which is not enough to have a successful farm. Also, if kids did get inheritance of the land, they were gone at boarding school. Hey, remember the land's held in trust by the government. Remember, the government views Native Americans as childlike. We think it's best if we take care of your land by selling it so we can get the money to do as we see fit. And that's what I kind of touched on. The Dawes Act broke up communities. You're taking this tight-knit community and group and you're saying, okay, we're going to give each of you individual plots of land where you can work on your own as opposed to work with other people. So they're breaking up this, just the basic idea of community for the Native Americans. Now, the Dawes Act did end in 1934, which is something important to remember. It did last for quite a while. The last thing I want to talk about is the Native American boarding schools. Now, the main goal of these boarding schools, you guessed it, it was to assimilate the natives. This was something that was pushed through with the Dawes Act. Now, I tried looking for the actual primary source documents where it talked about boarding schools in the Dawes Act. I couldn't find it. So if you can find it for homework tonight and show it to me or send me a link, thumbs up, that'd be awesome. Awesome. I would totally give you extra credit for that because I couldn't find it and I really would like to read about that. So part of the boarding schools, to assimilate these native children, they cut their hair first off. And as we've seen in a lot of pictures, as you can see pictures here, everyone had longer hair. A lot of cultures, long hair is kind of a sign of your society, a sign of wealth, and it's part of who you are. They were cleaned very harshly, cleaned with not nice, soft sponges, very coarse, harsh. They were given new clothes that were not, in any sense of the being, like their usual native clothes. It was very westernized American clothing. They also were forbidden to speak their native language. They were forbidden to practice their religion. They were forbidden to use their native name or practice their culture. And there were very, very harsh punishments for people who are caught doing this. I read a lot about how kids would just, they run away. They felt it was better to run than it was to stay in this and give them this treatment. I also read a lot how a lot of these kids never spoke English, so they had no idea what was going on with them. They didn't know why they were being punished if they spoke their native tongue or practiced their religion. Now, ultimately, they figured it out, but at first they had no idea, and these are just kids. The schools were also in very poor condition, so a lot of kids died from diseases. Now, what was the effect of these boarding schools? Well, first off, they lost their language because they'd be beaten if they spoke it. They lost their heritage. They weren't allowed to practice their religion or their culture. They were beaten if they did. Relationships were hugely lost. When they finally were sent out of these boarding schools, and it was 8 long years in these boarding schools, they go home. They can't speak the language. How do you communicate with mom and dad? Okay, then the kids don't go home. They go to the cities. Some of the kids were so fully assimilated, they were tired, they wanted a new culture, or they were so afraid to practice their culture. So these relationships are fractured because their parents see their kids as totally different. So thank you for sticking through this flip video. There's a new extra credit question on Edmodo. I encourage you to look at it. I think it's going to be very thought-provoking. It's all about assimilation. Also, answer the flipped questions on Edmodo as well. See you in class.